Before dawn, a Japanese destroyer entered the Taiwan Strait. It did not drift there by accident. It did not get lost. It did not wander into the most politically charged waterway in East Asia because a navigator made a mistake. It went in on purpose. And that matters because Beijing has spent years trying to build one very specific kind of power around Taiwan, not legal ownership, not open war, something quieter, and in some ways more effective than either of those, psychological ownership, the idea that the water may still belong to international law on paper, but the political tempo already belongs to China in practice. That has been the real project, not simply to threaten Taiwan. To teach everyone around Taiwan how to behave, fly enough aircraft, sail enough patrols, stage enough drills, send enough Coast Guard hulls, enough maritime militia, swarms, enough warnings, enough ugly repetitions, and eventually the region starts adjusting itself to China's preferred rhythm. Governments begin calculating that pushing back in visible ways is more dangerous than swallowing the pressure. And moving on, that is how coercion matures, not when the first shot is fired, when the other side starts behaving as if the shot never needs to be fired. That is why this one Japanese transit matters so much. Because the real story is not that a ship crossed the strait. The real story is that one of the most important countries in East Asia just demonstrated in public that it is no longer willing to keep validating the old Chinese script. Beijing protested. Beijing tracked. Beijing condemned. But Beijing did not stop the ship. That is the point that cuts deeper than the headlines. For years, China's regional method has depended on a simple trade. It creates pressure. Other countries create excuses. China pushes a little further. Everyone else tells themselves it is not worth the trouble. China repeats. Over time, the extraordinary becomes normal. The risky becomes routine. The map starts bending psychologically before it bends legally. That method only works if the other side keeps agreeing to play the passive role. This time, Japan did not, and it did not happen in a vacuum. The transit came after another message had already been sent into the region. Russian naval vessels had just visited China. The symbolism of that visit was obvious enough. Moscow and Beijing wanted the Pacific to see coordination. They wanted allies, rivals, and nervous middle powers to see a tightening pressure arc, not just China in the south, not just Russia in the north. A broader atmosphere of compression. Tokyo understood exactly what that atmosphere was meant to do, and Tokyo answered it with steel, not with a white paper, not with a complaint, not with a carefully balanced press conference about the importance of peace and stability. With a destroyer, that is why the act landed so hard in Beijing, because criticism is manageable. Sanctimony is manageable. Diplomatic outrage is manageable. What China does not want is a new regional pattern in which more and more states begin replying to gray zone coercion with visible, state-backed military signaling moves of their own. Once that begins, China's pressure stops looking inevitable. And once inevitability cracks, power becomes more expensive. To understand why this matters, you have to start with geography, because geography is the quiet author of almost every Pacific argument. China wants to act like a true blue water power. It wants room. It wants depth. It wants freedom to move major naval assets into the wider Pacific without feeling watched, funneled, and boxed in by hostile terrain. But the problem on Beijing's map is that before China can behave like an unconstrained oceanic power, it has to get out, and getting out is not simple. The first island chain is not just a phrase generals use in briefings. It is the belt of islands, channels, aircraft ranges, sensors, bases, submarines, and narrow exits running down from Japan through Okinawa toward Taiwan and onward toward the northern Philippines. From Beijing's perspective, it is a pressure ring. From Tokyo's perspective, it is leverage. That difference in perspective explains a huge amount of East Asian tension. If China sees the first island chain as strategic suffocation, then every country sitting on key portions of that chain becomes part of the problem. Japan is one of the biggest parts, not only because it is allied with the United States, not only because it possesses serious naval and air power, but because it occupies terrain that matters before a war even starts. Choke points matter. Monitoring points matter. Narrow seas matter. The ability to complicate movement matters. Japan does not need to match China vessel for vessel to matter in this game. It only needs to hold ground in sea space that China cannot ignore. That is why a harder Japan is strategically dangerous for Beijing. And that is the deeper meaning of the transit. It suggests that Tokyo is becoming less willing to behave like a cautious bystander sitting on priceless geography, while China tries to militarize the psychology of the region around it. Look at the pattern that led to this point. China's pressure around Taiwan and near Japanese controlled waters has not mostly taken the form of clean, openly declared military confrontation. It has taken the form that modern revisionist powers prefer when they want gains without immediate escalation, Coast Guard ships that operate like political instruments, not normal maritime police. Fishing fleets that look civilian from a distance and strategic up close. Airspace restrictions large enough to alter habits. Exercise zones wide enough to intimidate trade and movement. Near constant probing designed to exhaust everyone else into acceptance. The gray zone method is not just harassment, it is instruction. It tells the region again and again, live inside our pressure or risk something worse. Japan appears to have decided that this instruction manual is no longer acceptable. That is what makes the destroyer transit more than a transit. It is an answer, a calm answer. But an answer, a way of saying that if China wants to normalize coercion, other countries can normalize visible defiance. That is a different Pacific from the one Beijing has been trying to construct, and it becomes even more significant once you factor in how Tokyo sees its security environment. As a whole, Japan does not look at China alone. It looks south and sees Taiwan. It looks southwest and sees pressure around the Ryukyu and the East China Sea. It looks north and sees Russia, the Kuril dispute, the Russian Pacific Fleet, and a northern military problem that never really went away from Tokyo's point of view. These are not disconnected irritants. They are connected directions of pressure, a tightening arc. That is why the destroyer's passage should not be read only as a Taiwan message. It was also a broader regional message. To China, it said, pressure is no longer free. To Russia, it said, your presence will not automatically frighten Japan back into symbolic behavior. To the region, it said, Japan is changing. And that last point may be the most important of all because one of the biggest assumptions built into Asian security thinking for decades was that post-war Japan would remain strong but psychologically restrained, wealthy, technologically advanced, highly capable in certain domains, but reluctant to act in ways that looked openly forward, openly hard, or openly provocative. China benefited from that assumption. Russia benefited from that assumption. Both could calculate around Japan that carried real tools, but often wrapped them in caution. That version of Japan has not vanished overnight, but it is eroding. And erosion is enough to change calculations because once other countries begin to believe that Tokyo is no longer content with symbolic protest, every board shifts, the Taiwan board shifts, the East China Sea board shifts, alliance burden sharing shifts, Chinese planning shifts, regional signaling shifts. The reason is simple. A Japan that acts earlier, more visibly, and with greater comfort using its own steel changes the tempo of every crisis that touches the first island chain. This is not only about political will. Japan has been preparing materially for a harder map as well. Its destroyer fleet is not decorative. Its submarine force is built for serious work in serious waters. Its anti-ship posture matters. Its reach is growing. Its so-called defensive architecture is becoming more mobile, more layered, and more suited to denial than mere static homeland protection. That matters because China's biggest strategic desire in the Pacific is operational freedom. Japan is increasingly assembling the tools to make that freedom expensive, not by conquering anything, by complicating access, by making exits narrower, by making every Chinese show of force operate under heavier observation, heavier risk, and potentially heavier response. That is the real military logic hiding underneath what looked to many people like just another freedom. Of Navigation Story, it was not just a statement about principles, it was a preview of posture, a preview of how Japan may behave in a more dangerous Pacific where waiting quietly is no longer viewed as prudence, but as strategic surrender in slow motion. And that brings us to Beijing's humiliation, which is often described too cheaply. The humiliation is not that China was criticized. China gets criticized constantly. The humiliation is not even that one Japanese ship made a passage and survived. The humiliation is subtler than that and therefore more damaging. China has spent years trying to project inevitability around Taiwan and the first island chain. Not certainty of war, certainty of pressure, certainty that the region would keep adapting to what Beijing chose to make normal. Then, at a moment of maximum sensitivity, Japan behaved as if that inevitability did not exist. That is what hurts. Because power is not only weapons, it is belief. It is the ability to make others believe that resisting you is too risky, too lonely, too late. Once a major actor stops believing that, the image begins to crack. That crack matters more than any single protest note ever issued by a foreign ministry. China can still send more ships, it can still fly more aircraft, it can still stage larger exercises, it can still speak in harsher language, but every time another state visibly crosses a line, Beijing hoped everyone would fear, the aura weakens. And once aura weakens, volume alone does not restore it. Sometimes volume just exposes the problem more clearly because the question changes. The question is no longer whether China can threaten the region. Of course it can. The question becomes whether China can reliably convert threat into obedience. That is a much harder thing. Now look at the choices Beijing actually faced once the destroyer entered the strait. It could condemn, it did. It could track and shadow, it did. It could accuse Japan of harming bilateral relations, it did. But the choices that really matter are the ones it did not take. It did not physically block the ship. It did not trigger a direct armed standoff severe enough to stop the passage. It did not fire warning shots. It did not create a crisis immediate enough to test escalation at the highest level. Why not? Because China understands structure too, pressuring weaker or more ambiguous actors in gray zone settings. Is one thing physically stopping a Japanese destroyer in the Taiwan Strait is something very different. The ladder gets steep very quickly, the audience is global, the political consequences are immediate, the risk of miscalculation is far greater, and that reveals a trap that may define the next phase of East Asian tension. China's method depends on pressure, but as more states begin answering pressure with hard, visible, state-backed moves, the enforcement cost of China's preferred reality rises. The more Beijing tries to prove psychological supremacy, the greater the risk that direct enforcement of that supremacy becomes too dangerous to use cleanly. And once direct force becomes too risky, China is pushed back toward words. That is a bad exchange for a power trying to make the region feel that resistance is futile. Japan understood. That is why the move was sharp. Tokyo was not merely sending a ship through water. It was testing the outer edge of what Beijing is actually prepared to do when confronted not by vagueness, not by deniability, not by a half-living gray zone target, but by cold, deliberate state-level defiance. At least this time, China's answer was to monitor, protest, and absorb. That matters far beyond Japan. Taiwan watches that. The Philippines watches that. Australia watches that. India watches that. Washington watches that. Moscow watches that too, because once Japan starts acting this way, the strategic conversation shifts from whether China can keep raising pressure to whether the region may be entering a new era of organized counterpressure. And counterpressure does not mean calm. It means friction, more transits, more shadowing, more air patrols, more alliance signaling, more military concentration near lines that every side insists are politically vital, more chances for one pilot, one bridge crew, one radar contact, one chain of command under pressure to make a decision that turns theater into crisis. That is why this should not be read as a clean triumph for anyone. Japan scored a real strategic point. Yes, China took a real psychological hit. Yes. But the deeper truth is that East Asia just moved one step further away from the old pattern in which coercion met caution and one step closer to a new pattern in which coercion increasingly meets visible resistance in steel. That pattern is less stable. And there is one final layer that matters. This was not only about naval capability, it was about political identity for decades. Many in Asia assumed that Japan's history, domestic caution, and constitutional legacy would always impose a ceiling on how far Tokyo was prepared to go in public strategic confrontation. That assumption is weakening, not all at once, but enough to matter. And once that assumption weakens, the implications spill far beyond one destroyer and one transit. They spill into procurement, into doctrine, into alliance planning, into public expectations, into the next crisis, and the one after that. Because a Japan that no longer sees visible pushback as politically unthinkable changes every board it sits on. That is what this transit exposed. Not just Japanese nerve, not just Chinese embarrassment, a deeper structural change. The region is becoming more accustomed to a Japan that is quicker, harder, and less afraid of being described as provocative if the alternative is allowing Chinese coercion to harden into normality. That is the shift. And once that shift begins, it does not remain confined to one ship in one strait. It expands outward. Beijing will now have to decide whether future acts of defiance require sharper answers to restore fear. Tokyo will have to decide whether visible answers must continue if it wants to prevent a slide back into the older, more submissive regional pattern. That is a dangerous interaction because it fuses symbolism and military posture in the same narrow spaces. That is how signaling missions become crisis triggers. That is how manageable incidents accumulate into turning points. So yes, a Japanese destroyer crossed the Taiwan Strait. Yes, Beijing condemned it. Yes, the moment was extraordinary, but that is still not the deepest layer of the story. The deepest layer is that China's long campaign to make pressure feel permanent just ran into a visible refusal from one of the most consequential powers on the map. Not a minor actor, not a Coast Guard patrol, not a proxy. Japan, a country that understands exactly where the geography hurts China most. A country that knows the first island chain is not just a line of islands, but a structure of leverage, and a country that now seems increasingly willing to use that leverage in public. That is why this one transit matters, because it tells you the Pacific is entering a harder phase. And once a region enters a harder phase, the danger is not just what one side intends. The danger is what every side feels it has to prove next.